And I'm really pleased to have this year as the Bateman speaker, lecturer Elizabeth May, the 7th Bateman lecturer. Now, we've had a number of party leaders here before. In 2005, Stéphane Dion was here when he was leader of the Liberal Party, and Dr. Liza Ireland, who's here somewhere, where Eliza is here, who's teaching with us this summer. Liza's daughter, a reasonably overachieving high school girl, organized an international conference here and brought not only Stéphane Dion, but the, at that point, unelected, not Green Party leader Elizabeth May to campus, and it was fun having Stéphane Dion here. And then I believe it was last summer, we had the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, the Prime Minister, here as well on campus. We had a photo op for him and got to have my picture taken with him. I was on the Board of Governors at the time. And so Elizabeth, at least in my 8 or so years at Royal Rose, is the 3rd party leader to come here. But she is clearly the first member of Parliament who has been elected as a Green Party candidate and the first leader of the Green Party of Canada to be elected. And she's a, yes, well. And so it seemed a really natural choice to invite her to be the Robert and Birgit Bateman Lecturer this year. She's an environmentalist for sure, and an activist and a lawyer and a leader of the party, but she's also a writer and a communicator, and that's really the context in part that we've invited her here to be as a communicator and as a leader also. And Royal Roads has an interest in educating leaders. She became active in the environmental movement in the 1970s. She was a leader of organizations like Sierra Club of Canada for nearly 2 decades, graduate of Dalhousie Law School. She was involved with the Public Interest Advocacy Center, with Pollution Probe and Friends of the Earth. She helped found the Canadian Environmental Defense Fund. She's the author of 7 books. You know, that's anyone here publish more than 7 books? Not many people do. Her most recent book is called Losing Confidence: Power, Politics, and the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. She's an officer of the Order of Canada. She was elected leader of the Green Party in 2006, and in last May, as you all know, became the first Green Party candidate elected to office in Canada. She's also been, Newsweek magazine called her one of the world's most influential women, something I'm sure that she has blazoned above her bed or something. Bad research, yes. She lives in Sydney, British Columbia, as opposed to Sydney, Cape Breton, which might be more at home in some ways. It's really been an honor to have her here. She spoke to our graduating students at lunch. We've had a wonderful dinner, and she met with other Royal Road students this afternoon just because she's here. They were here, and they wanted to meet. And she's a great woman, a great leader, a great communicator, and my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth May.
Doesn't move, does it?
You want me to shut it off?
No. Well, you save the electricity. Hello. Well, first of all, I want to thank Rick. I wish I'd known that he'd had his picture taken with Stephen Harper, because usually my security people screen for that sort of thing, and then I wouldn't be here now. But fortunately, our rigorous review of the cyberspace world didn't reveal that. No, it's a real honor to be here. And it's also, I mean, there's a lot of congruity, synchronicity about this when you go through the list of previous speakers, but Bob and I've known each other a long time. Vicky's husband is basically a non-biological sister of mine, and my daughter's named after her, and then, of course, the lecturers in the name of Robert and Birgit Bateman, who have been longtime friends, and Bob was always extraordinarily supportive of my work at Sierra Club of Canada. He's quite nonpartisan, but Bob and Birgit are my constituents. They live on Salt Spring Island. My favorite thing about the lecture so far, which is really just weird, and some of you know because you had lunch with me, as you know, as I am required to do by my high position of leadership in the Green Party of Canada, I'm required to tweet. And Twitter world has a certain amount of odd things happen and one of them was, I don't know who this person was, because you never know, right? If any of you tweet in Twitter and you watch it and you don't know who's writing back to you or if you're going to run into them later. But someone wrote back, because Royal Roads University, having a very creative, current, and engaged communications team, tweeted that I was giving this lecture. And someone wrote back, For a minute, I thought it said you were giving the annual Bateman lecture. Like, holy sustainability, Bateman. It was kind of a wonderful thought came to mind of the lecture I would give if I were giving the annual Royal Roads University Bateman lecture. You'll have to think about that for another time. I do have one little thing to mention, so I don't forget to mention it at the end. I thought I'd mention it now, in the same vein in which Rick wants to remind us all that you can put donations there, which is a very good idea for the graduate students. I'm looking for donations, but not money. Just so you know, help me spread the word that in my role as Member of Parliament and leader of the Green Party, I'm hoping to have as many bright, wonderful interns as possible to work a spot of time on Parliament Hill. So if that sounds of interest to anyone, just file that away, think about it, share it with your friends, because we're hoping to fill a lot of intern spots for the fall. Well, the topic I've been given is daunting, environmental leadership and the times we're in and the role a university can play in all that. And that's what I'm going to play with in the themes I talk about for a while. And then I'm going to stop talking so we can have some conversation about these issues. And I really think that'll be the most fun part of the evening. That and the view behind you, which is extraordinary. And what a shame you have to look at me, but that's really... I get a great view. Okay, so the context in which we find ourselves, and this is the grimmest part of what I'm going to do, I want to talk about our context as a matter sort of a state of the planet, state of our society, quick context setting. Then think about what does leadership mean in that context. And then lastly, what does a university do to equip people for leadership? And hope that that sets some kind of useful framework for a discussion that we might have that follows formal remarks. The current state of things isn't good. I mean, we all know that. You wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be studying at Royal Roads, you wouldn't be grappling with topics of sustainability and environmental leadership if you weren't aware of the fact that right now on this planet we are facing numerous and accelerating threats to essentially to nature, to life on Earth, to the atmosphere, to all ways that you can analyze it as in terms of systems. We can say the carbon system is breaking down, overloading carbon. We've so overloaded the atmosphere, we've swamped the carbon sinks, that the things that I first learned about, I first started learning about climate science when through complete fluke, the Federal Minister of Environment in the Mulroney government asked me to come work for him as a senior policy advisor. I had no political affiliations, but if I had any, they wouldn't have been with his party. And he knew that, and he asked me to come work for him anyway. And my background had been as a grassroots organizer against pesticides, against nuclear energy, uranium mining, and so on. Acid rain, I'd worked on acid rain. I'd not worked on the climate issue at all. Now, this was the summer of 1986, and I worked in the federal government of Brian Mulroney from 86 to 88. And in that time, all the environmental issues in the minister's office were my job, and the rest of the staff were in charge of everything political. So I was in the minister's office itself, and what an incredible experience for someone who wanted to make a difference in the world was that I was in the position to say to bureaucrats, we're gonna hurry up the negotiations on Guayahanas National Park. We got to get that moving. And no, we're not going so fast on re-registering that pesticide. And yes, we're doing this, and it was quite extraordinary. But it was from the scientists at Environment Canada in '86, you see, that I first got my briefings on climate change. When I meet people, and I do, who think that climate change was a theory invented by Al Gore and has no science behind it, I back up. And we were talking earlier about communication, and I always think it's storytelling. And I back up and tell them, look, I was sitting in Environment Canada's offices with the scientists who were explaining to the minister that releasing greenhouse gases was going to, if we did not reduce the amount of, that we were dependent on fossil fuels, if we didn't reduce greenhouse gases, that the volume of greenhouse gases would inevitably destabilize global climate systems. And it wasn't just a matter of, yes, we think it's getting warmer, so how do we explain that it's getting warmer? Quite the opposite. It was looking ahead to say, we think we will see in Canada, and I can remember the scientists saying, we think by 2030 we may see glaciers in retreat. We think we'll see, if we don't act, a reduction in the Arctic ice cover. We'll see increasing frequency of extreme weather events. So as I've watched the science develop and the scientists work on the science, and of course things began to happen faster, as some of you are thinking 2030, we were seeing glaciers in full retreat by the late 1990s. By the year 2000, we've been seeing glaciers in rapid retreat from the Andes to the Rockies to the Alps. I mean, glaciers are in retreat everywhere. A lot of it was that that the scientists who were doing the analysis underestimated positive feedback loops. So then they started trying to work those into the system. That when you lose Arctic ice, for instance, you lose the albedo effect, so the more you lose ice, the faster the warmer heats up, so the more you lose ice, and so on and so forth. So all of the information that I had from this brief window of working inside government made me quite certain that scientists, number one, can't communicate. Number two, have never in their life, there's never any capability in the world globally for scientists, research scientists, to get together across disciplines, for paleontoclimatologists to work with glaciologists, to work with people looking at biological science, to work with people doing the physics of the weight of the ice on Greenland, as Dick Peltier does out of U of T, working with satellite measurements of the weight of the ice in Greenland and the weight of the ice in Antarctica to measure how fast it's thinning and melting. None of these people could in a million zillion years figure out how to organize a meeting, much less a global conspiracy to fool the world's politicians into deviating from the directions given to them by the power structure, being the oil and gas industry. I mean, it's so counterintuitive, it blows my mind that anyone could believe for a minute that there was anything less than solid and clear and compelling about climate science. So we have the information, I've lived with it, I've watched it develop, and that breakdown of global climate systems, that change, continues to accelerate bad news upon bad news. I mean, when I first started working on the issue, and until very recently, we weren't talking about carbonic acid and what it will do in the oceans. You know, we've been, as we go forward, we hit nasty shocks, right? We hit things like, we didn't initially think about coral reefs bleaching. There's a lot of things that we learn that come to us as sudden information that was unanticipated. And generally, to the extent that there are uncertainties about climate science, and there are some, there are just as many uncertainties that will be far worse than we think, that somehow it'll all be fine. So I'm sure you're all familiar with climate science. I wish I could say the same of the other members of Parliament, but that's another topic to come to in the course of discussing leadership. So the climate system is, to me, the most compelling and urgent danger facing the planet, but so too is the biological meltdown, the loss of species, which of course is related to the climate crisis, which is also related to the increasing urbanization on the planet, human systems that are shifting and changing and lead to geopolitical instability. Certainly, again, the climate crisis creating millions of refugees, and in the future, hundreds of millions of environmental refugees, unless we deal with it, becomes the single biggest geopolitical threat to global security. So we're in a time when nothing should matter as much as dealing with this issue. Nothing should matter as much to any government on the planet as making sure that we reduce greenhouse gases substantially and immediately to avoid runaway global warming. That means that best guessed estimates are that by the year 2015, and this is, of course, could be wrong, it could have been we missed it already, but it's not really productive to worry about that, but by the year 2015, global emissions of greenhouse gases must peak and begin to fall. That's basically a hard number. I don't think we can take any chances past that. We've already taken quite a lot of chances. So the wiggle room we had back in 1986, with the 1990s were dubbed the turnaround decade. We didn't do it. So the time we're in now is, unfortunately for all of us who are just coming to grips with this issue, the time at which procrastination is no longer an option. Delay is not an option. Denial is not an option. Doing something about it becomes our only choice. So that's, in some ways, good to know, because there are many things we can do and they're all doable. In a context like that, what does it mean to talk about leadership? What kind of leadership is helpful? And that's a trickier issue to talk about. Now, my title is leader, right? Leader of the Green Party of Canada. Well, the Green Party is an unusual organization. It's certainly different from the other political parties. As leader of the Green Party of Canada, I'm actually not in charge of anything. My job description is chief spokesperson. But I do spend a lot of time thinking about what leadership means. Rick mentioned my last book, Losing Confidence, Power Politics, and the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. And I spent a lot of time thinking about democracy itself and how to make democratic systems work. I mean, clearly something's wrong. We have a major disconnect when the Government of Canada has no climate plan. It's taken a while, goodness knows, for Australia to come forward. I don't know how many of you saw Julia Gillard, Prime Minister of Australia, went on national TV with one of those immediate, we have a crisis, I have to speak to you as a nation, prime ministerial addresses to say the science is solid, the climate is changing, we're suffering the effects already, we can't ignore this, and then she put forward a carbon tax plan that they'll be implementing. Very difficult to do in a context in which she's extremely unpopular as Prime Minister in a minority parliament, being supported, and the reason she's Prime Minister is because of the Greens in the Australian Senate and House. But she did it, and she went on national television to say the climate is in serious crisis. Jeffrey Simpson in the Globe and Mail made the point, can anyone imagine this happening in Canada? The carbon tax that was announced by Nicolas Sarkozy a couple of years ago, he said, civilization itself is at stake. We can't avoid taking action. He brought in his carbon tax post-financial meltdown. Right? So the world's economies are reeling, but the government of France says we better bring in a carbon tax because civilization itself is at stake. So there's different models of government action, but you need to feel that there is a willingness and the moral courage and the political will to take action in your government. It's kind of a prerequisite to believe that your democracy is working at all. So in that context of leadership, there's different kinds of leaders. I'm very concerned that, and I'm going to talk about leadership in a political context, and I promise you I'm going to shift to what it means in societal terms, which will have more relevance for most of you. But we live in a constitutional monarchy with Westminster parliamentary democracy, and our Constitution doesn't even mention the existence of political parties. They're not an essential part of our system. They're an add-on created by political parties, and it's a voluntary association. Members of Parliament choose to become part of a party, they get elected, and we do not, and I think you probably all know this, but it's worth repeating, we do not directly elect our Prime Minister. So the idea that we do comes through the way we refer to politics in Canada, and the dominance of leaders, the fact that in an election campaign, we even have a leaders debate. And the reason that they didn't have one until the last election in the UK was that the UK held on much longer to, this is a parliamentary democracy, and the Prime Minister is merely first among equals. The choice of Prime Minister in the UK is a little bit different because the head of the party is chosen by their caucus and not by the whole collectivity of members of that party, which means that, and they did the same in Australia, which is why Margaret Thatcher could be removed by her caucus, why Julia Gillard could become Prime Minister in Australia by displacing Kevin Rudd. So, but Canadian democracy is a little bit different. Our party structure mimics more of the culture of US politics without its constitutional attributes. So we have a system where increasingly, and I'm not just referring to Stephen Harper, but over the years, the business of who is the leader of a party, and it's a question of integrity of the leader when you go to vote and all those kinds of questions, that's really morphing the Westminster parliamentary tradition more towards a US model, more towards the idea that you're voting for Layton or, in last case, Ignatieff or Harper, right? That's how the media wanted us to see it because I wasn't in that mix at all, and Greens weren't in that mix, but that's another whole issue. It's interesting, too, how, especially after how the election turned out, on the question of the leaders' debate, Stephen Harper's first response was very clever and skillful to avoid actually discussing the fact that I'm quite sure he'd wanted to keep me out of the debate, say, well, I wouldn't mind if she was in the debate, but the debate we really should have is between Michael Ignatieff and me, because it's either one or the other of us. fascinating now that we have an official opposition that's the NDP, and Michael Ignatieff lost his seat. And yet a lot of people in the media gravitated to that argument. Right, that's right, Harper's right. Mano a mano, right? It's really going to be Ignatieff versus Harper. That's the debate we should see. No, actually, we should have a lot more debates, and we should have a lot of debates that don't involve the leaders. Tom Axworthy at the Center for the Study of Democracy at Queen's Universities put forward a quite extensive proposal for different kind of leaders' debates in Canada, where the goal would be not just the leaders, but the critics. You know, so you'd have let's discuss international development assistance, and we'll have Bev Oda debate, Paul Doerr, you know, so on. So you can see getting it down from this fixation on the leader would be healthy in our democracy. Now, within that, there's different kinds of models of leadership, and this applies politically, of course, as well as in a more generalized social context. So just in general, and not referring to it in terms of just the politics of it, there are some people who aspire to leadership because they want to be completely in charge. It's very attached to ego. It's very much a power position to be in charge, to be the leader, to control everything. In the spectrum of that in other countries, or even in terms of the model of leadership in a democracy, you get someone who sees themselves as dictator/leader, control everything, and control them for your own benefit. Slightly better in on that spectrum, I call, is the benevolent dictator. Someone says, it's better that I control everything because I'm smarter than everyone else, but I'll do it in the public interest, and I'm really concerned for everybody else's welfare. The best thing in terms of our traditions is the prime minister who says, I see myself as first among equals, and my job here is to make the system work better, to empower other people to do a good job, and to find political consensus where it exists. And that is closest to, but at the other end, so at the pillar end away from dictatorship, is the servant leadership model, which I think a lot of you will be familiar with from the, because it was the title for servant leadership came from the work of Robert Greenleaf, and is, I think, familiar to all of you. When I was executive director of Sierra Club of Canada, that was when I first came across servant leadership, and I thought, okay, this is what I'm doing, because I'm executive director, which sounds like a sort of a title that would suggest I was in charge, but really my job is, because I was in a grassroots environmental organization, to work to help the grassroots volunteers of this organization do the best they can to empower people, to give them the tools and the skills. So that model of servant leadership is the one that I always liked, and it's the one I still hope I'm pursuing in the work I now do in politics. But in that spectrum, you go from selfishness to selflessness. There's a lot of ways of dissecting it, and people who are really equipped for leadership to do the most good for society are those who say, okay, I have this job to do for the good of society. And that was, you know, part of what comes out of Greenleaf in terms of servant leadership is people who see that they have responsibilities to the world, that it's not even as directed as my organization, but a larger context of relationship. I mean, he wrote about it that it begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. And this then becomes a conscious choice that brings one to aspire to lead. And then the opposite one he describes, of course, is someone whose interest is in leading first, and then eventually thinks it might actually help me in a sort of a manipulative way if I wanted to pretend to serve, right? So, but the true servant leadership model comes from someone whose first commitment is, how do I serve? And then from there thinks, well, I better figure out how I can lead. I mean, the ultimate in political leadership, and this quote, I think it was falsely attributed to Gandhi, because I went looking for it before talking to you, with the notion of, well, I'll give who it is. I think it really did come from Alexandre Auguste Ledru-Rollin, who was a leader in the French Revolution, and in 1848 at least is reputed to have said, maybe apocryphal, "There go my people. I must find out where they are going so I can lead them." And sometimes I said, I really think it was apocryphal to suggest that Gandhi ever said, there go the people, I better catch up with them so I can lead them. That doesn't sound like Gandhi at all to me. So I think it's much more likely a French revolutionary. But there is that notion of, you know, are you really leading? Are you following? Are you enabling? Are you mobilizing? And the kind of leadership that we need now, I think, I'll say it categorically, we don't need any dictator leaders. We don't need them at all. What we need to be useful in a leadership role, given the context of the crisis we're in, are people who do not see themselves in a hierarchical fashion as in charge, but rather people who are prepared to take a lead, show a lead, demonstrate to others how to live, give people hints, educate friends and neighbors. We were talking about that earlier with the class. But what we need is really a movement. Paul Hawken has written about it in a wonderful book called Blessed Unrest, in which he attempts to describe and quantify a movement that's happening globally, everywhere, all at once, on all corners of the earth, which he calls this blessed unrest. He tried to add up the number of advocacy organizations working on environmental issues, human rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, international development, anti-poverty, all kind of a collectivity of movements that coalesce around common solutions all the time. The solutions to one set of issues, climate justice is one of the great movements which completely brings together social justice and the climate issue and makes them real through stories and examples of what are we going to do, what is it that Canadians should do about the fact that our pollution is leading to entire island states being endangered. Not ours alone, but per capita, ours a lot. So those issues of climate justice really bring them into sharp focus. And when Paul Hawken described these movements, he said it's a fascinating thing. He gave up when he'd counted several million such groups. It's a fascinating thing to see the spread of a global movement with similar ideas, similar precepts, and similar values, where there is no leader. There is no one book. Everyone isn't running around holding a little red book or any other form of book. It's a movement that's spreading through a lot of people who are concerned about the same things, struggling to figure out what do we do, and finding common solutions, and finding them at the grassroots level, and then having to convince governments this is what we need. So the solution to global problems, I don't believe, will come from one or two political leaders. It's going to come from the leadership of a grassroots mobilization. It comes from movement politics, not individualized leader as great man theory. That's not going to work. So given that that's the kind of leadership we need, we'll move to what I think universities can do to help us have those kinds of leaders. And I think Royal Roads is perfectly positioned and already doing a lot of this. So one aspect of servant leadership that I left out, which I should have mentioned, is that it has a spiritual dimension. And so does the movement globally. The movement in Blessed Unrest, and I think even Paul Hawken's use of the word blessed in describing what he's describing, suggests that he has a sense of a spiritual awareness to this movement. There is a conscious or unconscious call to people to put aside short-term concerns for wealth, career, consumer addictions, and focus on what really matters, and to then find fulfillment not from the material world, but from a greater growth and nurturing of an internal sacred core of being. That's something that I think needs to be recognized, because we operate as though we're dealing with issues, not dealing with issues. We're dealing with survival. And in that context, everything blends into one big problem, which means the solutions come from one place. And they really are rooted in values. So when we talk about the environmental issue or the climate crisis as though it's a technological problem or an economic problem, we have absolutely all the solutions we need technologically. We have absolutely all the solutions we need economically. This is not a technocratic, expert problem. This is a problem of the power structures in most countries being unwilling to examine that the addiction to fossil fuels is immoral. That's a hard one. No one likes to talk about morality in looking at an energy system. I loved an essay that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wrote for Harper's Magazine on the eve of Barack Obama's election, in which he said to him, and it was an open letter to Barack Obama, think of the fossil fuel issue the same way we think of slavery. It was the economic engine for growth for the U.S., but slavery was immoral. And we had to, the U.S. had to turn away from what was their energy source, enslaved human beings, that was running an economy successfully, and turn away from that for moral reasons. And Robert Kennedy's article was great because it went on to say, you know, we didn't talk about better slavery, more beneficial slavery, kind of like the equivalent of where do we find the scrubber for the smokestack on this problem. It had to be a full, complete abolition. And I think that's where we're going to have to move to on the fossil fuel issue. We have to start thinking of it as a moral question, and we have to start thinking about it in terms of abolition. What can a university do in terms of developing the skills that create great leaders for the environmental movement? And I'm saying the environmental movement, it could be the social justice movement, it could be societal survival, I don't care how we describe it. And I don't, again, I hope I just stress again, I'm not talking about one or two people emerge as leaders and then we're all saved. Basically, it means a movement where everybody's working in a leadership role and in a non-hierarchical fashion. So to develop those skills, I think most important, there's a long list, but what a university can do, critical thinking. It's so important to really be able to take information, digest it, think it through, think for yourself, argue for yourselves, be prepared to take people on, write letters to the editor, be prepared to communicate what you've learned, but be critical, be skeptical about the information received till you're really confident in your bones that what you've got is truth and what you're dealing, as much as we can ever know the truth, and that you're able to think it through and work it through with others. So critical thinking is huge. Empathy. It's enormously important that we're able to empathize with those who don't agree with us yet. It's very important that we're able to empathize with future generations who aren't here to speak for themselves. A kind of a sterile argument that tries to bring people on side with mountains of data, it's not likely to work. But if we can put ourselves in the position of the people whose views we're trying to change, if we can empathize, we're going to be able to make that change much more quickly. Creativity. Have to be able to find new ways to do things because what we're doing now isn't working. So think creatively, think outside. I hate think outside the box, and I almost just said it, and then I did. I have to figure out new ways of doing things and reaching into a lot of what can change. You know, we're seeing a lot of coverage, at least last night on the National, I was watching sort of a retrospective of the Ethiopian famine and the work of Bob Geldof and We Are the World, now because we're now looking at Somalian famine, which of course is due to climate change. But there was, you know, who would have thought that a slightly over-the-hill rocker was going to be able to form a real movement that fed people? So creativity, it goes beyond, you know, the thinking that this is a subject that can only be dealt with by certain experts. It means we have to think way beyond that. And a really important thing, and I don't know if universities can help with this, so Rick has this, but I don't know how well we can teach this, really got to have a sense of humor. If we don't hang on to our sense of humor, especially if you think you're going to be a leader, you better keep your sense of humor about yourself. Because self-deprecating humor will do you a whole lot more good than walking around thinking you're a leader. Extremely dangerous behavior, I will say. So that's just a kind of a group of, a cluster of things that I think we need coming out of students, coming out of universities. It's the ability to face where we are in the world, clear-eyed, realistically. Yeah, it's scary, but we've worked our way out of scary spots before as humankind. I really do have a lot of faith in humanity. There's not a lot of evidence for my faith, but I think when you look at what there's tremendous human ingenuity in the face of problems. We're tremendously adaptable as a species. We've solved other problems. We've solved things from, the ozone depletion issue was deadly serious, and the negotiations weren't easy. That's just one example. But we're much more likely at this point to be able to put it the other way around. When I was a child, the specter that was over everybody's head in the way that now we worry about the climate crisis was a mushroom cloud. It just hung there. And, I'd go to school and there'd be, drills for nuclear annihilation, Well, that's not going to be a drill you're going to survive when it's the real thing. So we've managed to avert the Cold War, sign on to treaties to eliminate nuclear weapons. We're not doing as good a job as we should. That was a technological threat that certainly is on a scale with the climate crisis. We've managed to avert and change things that seemed unchangeable. When I think about the issues that I've worked on over my life, I grew up with a mom who was working against nuclear weapons testing. Atmospheric nuclear weapons testing was what I was learning about when I was 3 and 4 and 5. So that I would go to the playground and explain to other children that they shouldn't eat the snow because it contains strontium-90. It was important that I explain this to them. But, that issue was successfully won by really a lot of people like my mom. An awful lot of average people in Britain and the US and Canada who said, no, this is dangerous what we're doing and it's dangerous to our children's health. When I think about how many years we protested against apartheid in South Africa, that didn't seem that was ever going to change. The fact that Nelson Mandela ever emerged from that tiny little cell and became president of South Africa is an extraordinary thing, historically shattering. Hard to believe it could have even happened. If it had never happened, of course, that's the thing about things that haven't happened yet. You can't believe they could happen. I share this with you to give you some hope for those of you who don't think that we're going to solve the climate crisis. Nobody could have imagined that people would ever be dancing on the Berlin Wall and disassembling it block by block. That happened because Mikhail Gorbachev wasn't prepared to send troops. A different person there, a different year. If it wasn't Gorbachev, who knows what would have happened. Getting Nelson Mandela out of jail, this is a weird one, but Brian Mulroney really helped a lot. The decision to say Canada would support pushing South Africa out of the Commonwealth, even though Margaret Thatcher would not do that because she was too close to South Africa. Commonwealth action, plus the millions of letters written by the millions of people who tried to divest their investments from South Africa. So in terms of environmental, the leadership we need now to get out of the difficulties we're in, number one, I believe we can and will and must. It's a question of necessity, so I prefer to believe we will get out of the place we're in right now globally in terms of our addiction to fossil fuels. I know we can do it technologically, I know we can do it economically, therefore we should be able to do what needs to be done while there's still time. There's precious little time, which is why, in terms of your role, each and every one of you, there's a leadership role for you in spreading the word, in demonstrating what needs to be done, and in ensuring that there isn't any place or any time where you see something and don't take an action about it if it involves educating people and taking action on climate. This includes being, when I talk about critical thinking, being a very strong media critic. The politicians in this country would not be allowed to ignore the climate crisis if they weren't enabled to do that by a compliant media. I was mentioning earlier at dinner, I was watching the national news last night. There was the story of the freak event in Ottawa which destroyed the stage at Blues Fest. There was the story of how people are coping with the heat waves. And then there was, of course, much more seriously, the Somali drought and famine. And nowhere in any of those stories did anyone mention climate change. So when we see things going on around us, an unwillingness to mention what's obvious, it really will help to educate people and to push others to action if you take the time, and I know this sounds absurd given you're doing theses, you're doing research, start making it a point of once a day, once a week, writing a letter to a newspaper somewhere in Canada, posting comments on their online versions, just continually educating people and saying, look, it's time that you started mentioning what this issue is that you keep writing about, right? Flooding in Canada is because of the climate crisis. The melting Arctic ice is because of the climate crisis. It's costing our economy billions already. What are you waiting for? Whatever message you choose to share, it really matters to use the tools that we have that are there that help push the media to help get the climate where, the political climate, where politicians can no longer afford to ignore the issue. Your role as servant leaders, empowered leaders, and fearless leaders is absolutely essential. There's time enough, but there isn't quite enough time. And with that, I thank you for being here, and I'd be grateful to talk to you about any ideas that strike you. We need all hands on deck, and that's a different message than we only need the leaders. We need all hands on deck, and we need you now. Thank you. You're going to help me out here. Any hands? Any questions?
We're all intimidated.
Oh, oh, that would be awful. There's a hand.
This is with regards to a choice that the Green Party made about the deputy leader a few years back, and to bring in someone who was not so much a politician, in an effort, I think, to involve more people, a broader spectrum of people and faces in politics. And I'm in the third generation that votes Green in my family, and so my family's all very supportive, but my dad would want me to ask, you know, how was that panned out, and did that have the desired effect of involving more people in the dialogue?
Well, for those of you who don't know, my deputy leader is a former NHL hockey player named Georges Larac. He's Haitian from Montreal area, but he played for the Edmonton Oilers, so he has a huge following in Edmonton as well. Probably my most fun moment in the 2011 campaign was a street hockey game with George in Calgary, where we had hundreds of screaming fans. This would have been even better if the national media had covered it, but I was the only federal party leader to campaign in Calgary in 2011, which was kind of interesting. Anyway, I think it's working out quite well. George is a volunteer for the Green Party, and he's really an interesting man. He would not run as a candidate this time because he said, I don't know enough. I wouldn't want to be a member of parliament and not know enough to do a good job. And he said, Elizabeth, you get, so I've been really, it is a role of mentoring from me to him to help him learn all our policies, because I sure want him to run next time, because he'll get elected. He did a lot of events across the country, but particularly to help us in Quebec. And, you know, you never really know. I do know that when we announced that he'd become deputy leader in August of last year, it was the most media hits we had ever had or anything we ever did. And so we'll see. You know, it's he's his interest in this issue, what brings him to this issue is animal rights, and he's very, very active, militant vegan. I am still not forgiven by George for being a vegetarian who eats cheese. This is not something he will forgive, but he is an extremely lovely man, and I love working with him. So, yeah, and it certainly breaks up the usual politics, because when George talks about politics, he doesn't talk like a politician, even less so than I do. So that's reaching people who otherwise would never pay any attention at all. Your dad wanted to know. Thank you for being the third generation to vote Green. I'd never met anyone like you before. Okay.
At one point in your talk, you linked urbanization with loss of species. But isn't urbanization one of the ways, increasing the density in urban areas, one of the ways that we actually preserve more green space? And if we took all those people and spread them out over the uninhabited parts of the world, wouldn't we just lose all the trees?
Yeah, if I linked urbanization to loss of species, it was unintentional. So in terms of global trends that are really worrying, if as more and more people live in cities, it magnifies human misery, and as fewer people are, and if you look at certainly in terms of the growth in Mexico City, just to use an example, it's not just because people want to live in cities. In Mexico, it was very much related to NAFTA and the dumping of corn in Mexico at prices that Mexican farmers could no longer compete. So they were driven off the land. So people who are living on the land sustainably, which is a bit of an assumption, but living on the land sustainably and growing food and is a good thing. As people abandon rural areas for cities, the lands where they were farming are not being reclaimed by Siberian tigers. And the more that people are miserable, the more likelihood there is that rare animals are poached. So there needs to be there just needs to be a much clearer understanding. Urbanization trends, there's more potential for geopolitical instability. Human misery is not a good condition on the planet. And the fact that so many people are in urban areas living in conditions that fall below the term squalor in terms of their quality of life is a global problem. That's all I was saying. And but in terms of the threat to species, the biggest issue is the climate crisis. That's the biggest issue in terms of species survival, which is why, and the biggest issue in terms of a threat to water quality and quantity is also the climate crisis. So there are so many interwoven impacts to accelerating releasing of greenhouse gases. I think 2010 was the highest level of greenhouse gas level emissions in the history of the planet. We had a brief dip in 2009 due to the recession, but it more than recovered and surged in 2010. So again, making sure greenhouse gas levels peak and start to fall no later than 2015 is a very tall order, but it's doable.
Sir, Bob.
Yeah, I've got a comment and then a question, Elizabeth. One is, my comment would be that the first time I heard about climate change was a lecture given by J. Tuzo Wilson in 1972 at the University of Guelph. And I remember him muttering and talking about these changes in the atmosphere and everything. So I guess I've got 14 years on you.
Yeah.
So I'd say there are two elephants in the room. One is climate and the other is population. And you didn't speak about population. And I'm just wondering if you'd talk about that second elephant in the room.
Okay. Well, I'm really proud of the fact that the Green Party of Canada is the only political party with a population policy in our document, Vision Green, which is on our website for anyone who wants to look up all our policies. So we talk about global population pressures and the need to ensure that the UN says we're going to level off at 9 billion people. That's quite beyond, we're well beyond the carrying capacity of the planet as it is, but it's not purely population, it's population and consumption and technology in that equation that Paul Ehrlich put forward years ago. So the impact is a function of numbers of people plus their technology and their consumption patterns. Our policy, and what I think makes the most sense of anything, of course, is to empower women and girls all around the world to ensure literacy, access to primary health care, reproductive rights, economic autonomy, and political autonomy for women around the world. As that happens, it's just absolutely empirical. It's in lockstep. Birth rates fall. Absolutely solid across all cultures. Birth rates fall. The reason I threw in political autonomy as being really important and economic autonomy is that in Saudi Arabia, where women have good rates of literacy, relatively good health care, and live relatively well, and certainly not in poverty, but Saudi Arabian women continue to have a high number of, have a fairly high fertility rate because they lack political or economic autonomy. So that piece of what we can do is a nice one because, number one, it doesn't require intrusive, invasive, or culturally offensive policies such as what was done in India years ago with the forced sterilization of women. It says to people, you choose what you want, but we're going to make sure that it also alleviates human suffering, and it liberates half of the world's population, which is also the half of the world's population that does the most work, grows the most food, to be able to do that in more healthy and sustainable fashion while having fewer children. So it's a good policy, and it's what we should be doing globally, which is why it's so maddening to me that Canada's contribution to the maternal and child health policies globally is to say we won't give money to any organizations that are going to provide abortions. We're the only country left that's using George Bush's policies.
Sir,
Maybe the other side of that equation being consumption, what are some leverage points to combat consumption, maybe in more urbanized nations?
Well, I think this is also a values question. We are in North America, we are the giant consumers of the planet, but others are trying to catch up with us. So they've, I remember once I was doing a lot of work in the northern Amazon, and it was always interesting to be, I think it was on the back of a flatbed truck going through a village, and wherever there was electrification, wherever there was a village restaurant or whatever, everybody was watching Dallas. And I thought, oh, this can't be good. This is, so the Hollywood has marketed the American way of life as the way to be happy, well beyond the borders of the United States. Certainly have done it effectively in Canada. So we had to be taught conspicuous consumption. It's not naturally part of the human condition. And I say this because being 57 and having grandparents that I remember who lived through the Depression, most of you won't have that. But if you have any elders in your family who lived through the Depression, you'll know that the watchwords and the values of that experience were waste not, want not. These are just choices that are cultural of what you say and how you live. And we've been acculturated through deliberate, targeted marketing and advertising, so that our society has shop till you drop is the opposite part of that polar sloganeering of how you live. And that's been because the assumption is that the economy matters the most. Now that's an assumption we have to attack because it's absurd. The economy can't matter the most. People matter the most. An economy is only useful if it's meeting the needs of the people who live in that society, and it's providing goods and services people want. And by all means, people who provide the goods and services other people want should make money doing it, or they won't want to keep doing it. So it's not an anti-capitalist argument, but the idea that the economy is the most important thing and completely defines the political discourse. What's good for the economy is the serious discussion, and whether we're going to survive on the planet or not is apparently an irrelevant concern, because it's not about, it's really, when you think about it, it's absolutely mind-blowing. So dealing with consumption becomes something of an anti-patriotic message. So what you're saying is, don't shop till you drop. Just buy what you need. Save some money. Don't max out your plastic. What's interesting now is that in the wake of the bubble bursting in the fall of 2008 through the shenanigans of a completely corrupt group of people who were running the hedge funds and derivatives out of Wall Street and in financial centers around the world, some people are beginning to realize, uh-oh, I better figure out how to save. I tuned in completely randomly the other day to something on U.S. television. I was visiting my stepson in Vancouver, and for some reason they have a million more channels than I'd ever want to watch. But there was some, okay, so I wasn't going to plan to talk about this because I don't know who this was. There was some woman on U.S. TV with what was obviously a cult-like following, explaining to people how to save their money and how not to buy things. I thought, oh boy, she'll be lucky if she lives another day, and because this is very, very serious heretical stuff. The model of the U.S. economy has been for the last, well, post-war anyway, but accelerating through the 70s, and it has been, well, when it first started, I think I was just in school, was the idea of buy now, pay later. That was a new concept. And then you have to keep buying more because you need to for the sake of the economy. Never more, the epitome of this, the crystallization of how insane this is, was really when George Bush's first public address to a mourning U.S. public after 9/11 was, now's the time to go out and buy a new car. Do it for your country, go out and buy a new car. I mean, so that's where maybe things are shifting, and not just because people are realizing that there's an insanity in consuming the whole planet in our lifetime, but they're beginning to figure out, I don't really want to be so vulnerable that I'm all maxed out on charge cards and mortgages at the next time these guys make a mistake and the economy comes tumbling down around my ears. I'd rather have some money in the bank than have the latest flat screen TV and newest car in the yard. So there may be a counter movement to this. We need to also talk about it in terms of values. Certainly most of the young people I know, and of course I'm privileged to know people who are active in Young Greens or active in Sierra Youth Coalition, have been thinking for a long time about how to reduce their consumption. how to make sure that they're not buying stuff they don't need, how to live lower on the food chain, all those kinds of sensible concerns. And Bill Reese's ecological footprint is, I think, probably pretty hardwired in all of you in terms of how you make your choices. Spreading that out, maybe jumping opportunistically on this latest trend, if it's a trend, but boy, the people who were cheering for this woman when she said, don't live within your means, live below your means. People were like, oh, wonderful, wonderful. I mean, it was what that kind of TV show. And I thought, this is unusual. So.
Who were the sponsors of the TV show?
I don't, you see, that's what I just, it was, I think it was even on, it was on one of those, like, it was almost like an infomercial show. Yeah, weird. It was very weird.
Yes.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. It's very nice to hear you. I was wondering, I'm sorry to take you a little bit out of the topic that you're on right now, but since we're all learning that we're all of this is interconnected, I guess it's not that far. I was wondering how you felt about shale gas, because in Quebec, let's say not, I'm trying to spare my words. I don't want to use the word protest, but the mobilization has sort of made sure that shale gas issues were really well addressed, and there seems to be quite a bit of a change in that sense, in that perception that shale gas is not something that we would need as an alternate, in the meantime, resource. And from what I've read so far in BC, there doesn't seem to be that sort of emergency or feel the threat. So I was wondering, how do you feel about that?
Well, and thank you. The fact that we're pulling bitumen out of the Athabasca tar sands and finding ways with massive impacts to the environment, but also inputs of energy and water per barrel of bitumen. There's no way that anyone would be developing bitumen in the tar sands if we weren't running out of oil. In the same way, there's no way we'd be going after shale gas if we hadn't already passed peak on natural gas supplies. So these are kind of the death throes of the addiction problem. This is people willing to do anything for their fix. We have to fight fracking in British Columbia. We have to fight it everywhere across Canada because it's poisonous to water. It's very dangerous to groundwater supplies, and it makes no sense for the kind of investment they put into fracking. Putting money into energy conservation, putting money into renewables is much more sensible. It's snuck up on people because it emerged virtually everywhere all at once across Canada, with some people presenting it as, and initially the Jean Charest government appeared to be thinking this was going to be fine, and the blowback was pronounced. So I don't think it's the case that people aren't protesting it enough in BC. I think the problem is right now there's such a focus on making sure that Enbridge Pipeline doesn't bring bitumen crude across the northern part of the province to Kitimat, that we don't have oil tankers moving from the port at Kitimat out to sea, that we don't have, there's so many assaults all at once that I don't think fracking necessarily has hit everybody's consciousness quite as much. But regionally where they're developing it, there's tons of protests. And our policy position, if you hadn't guessed, is no fracking at all anywhere. Yeah, Rick, I can see you there.
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a bit about just the relationship between movement politics, leaders, and sort of personal fulfillment of people who get involved in this kind of stuff. You know, in fact, how do people get involved, remain sane, remain committed, and
Making the big assumption they're on the same party.
yeah, and work effectively in movement.
Yeah. Movement politics, I mean, I've been involved in a lot of movements through my lifetime. Movement politics can be the most satisfying thing you ever do, because one of the things that makes life particularly satisfying is knowing that your life has meaning. The quest for meaning is, is in many ways a bigger challenge to our survival than the physical limitations and threats to the planet. So one of the things that it was just something just came to me about gazillion years ago, when I was working, I was suing the pulp company in Nova Scotia to stop them from spraying Agent Orange. And there were 13 of us that were plaintiffs, and it had sucked us dry for 2 years in terms of bank accounts and effort, and the judge had ruled against us, and they'd seized our land. I mean, it was a long, sad story. Things were going very badly. And my mother went in to get the car repaired, and while she was waiting in the waiting room at the auto repair shop, the guy said to her, he said, well, he said, I know you're going through a really bad time, because the fact that we lost our land, he recognized he knew who my mom was for some reason, and he said, I know you're going through a bad time. He said, I want you to know something, though. He said, I really envy you, because your life matters for something. Your life really means a lot, and what you're doing means a lot for other people. And my mom came back from that garage in a completely different state of mind, because all she was thinking was, oh God, a car repair bill. How the hell am I going to pay the car repair bill? The mechanic didn't charge her either. Yeah, but anyway, she came back in a completely different frame of mind. So we take it for granted, some of us that are in a struggle, a quest, working for change in society, that, you know, that it may be hard work and it's not going to be rewarding financially compared to other work. But forget about the fact that we're so lucky, because a life that has meaning, and also in a movement, you have colleagues who matter to you enormously. And without even thinking about it, you have a support network. You have people who are really there for you no matter what. And the broader the movement, the bigger that network. So movement, that's where the reward comes, I think, is in knowing that you're actually doing something of value.
Yeah. Could you please comment on the message of climate awareness for children?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a school teacher, and a lot of my cohort is as well. And you know, getting the message to them that to become involved with nature and the environment without frightening them, so that they are growing up with a sense of despair.
Yeah. It's very important for children to know, and I also think for young people up to 40 to know, because it's been a long time since we've had a major environmental win. So a lot of people, I find, even in their early 20s, early 30s, have a hard time imagining that victory is possible in a big struggle such as against the oil and gas and coal industry of the planet, right? But it is, right? So when I talk to kids groups, I like to start with a whole litany of issues and campaigns that we've won. In fact, I think kids can handle information about climate, but you just don't present it as a case of despair. That would be outrageous. Connecting with nature is important. Understanding photosynthesis is important, and understanding that there's just not enough trees on the planet to soak up all the carbon we're releasing, so planting trees is a good thing. That's a nice, positive thing for kids to know. So I mean, I'm probably judging this, again, based not on any kind of empirical research, but just in my own life experience in terms of how the kids that are around me have grown up knowing about this and not finding it frightening and not despairing over it. It would be unbearably wrong to frighten children about the future and the climate crisis. But it isn't wrong to level with them, because they know it's out there, and don't their lives deserve to have meaning too? You know, the earlier they know that they're powerful as political entities, the earlier they know they can write a letter to the Prime Minister and get it taken seriously. I mean, there's a certain amount of, you know, I had some friends who wanted their kids not to know about anything. Doesn't really help them become interesting adults, to be kept in a bubble about what's going on in the world. I said earlier when I was talking to some of you that I feel the context we're in right now, it's as if we're in the resistance. I mean, I think that's the moral equivalent. It's if we were in Vichy France in the resistance movement, or maybe in occupied Netherlands in the resistance. So it doesn't matter, you know, we have to take these stands, and they're moral stands, we have to take them. Kids who grew up in that environment too were part of that entire cultural context. They weren't isolated from it because they were children. We don't want to frighten our kids, but empowering them to know these things are going on and we're working on them and it's going to get better, is, I don't think, a bad thing for kids to learn as they're growing up.
I would comment, Lindsay, that there is some empirical work that's been done on what frightens children. And one of the things that is clear from a number of those studies is that children become more frightened when they know that adults won't talk to them about things than they do when you will. But how you do that, of course, matters.
Yeah, I did a lecture for my daughter's grade 3 class on climate. And I went into the class, it was the teacher's idea, and I went to class with chalk, and I drew it all out on the board and explained how the climate thing, how the climate systems work and where fossil fuels came from. And when I finished, my daughter said to me, "Mom, that was so great. I think you could explain it to anyone. I think you could explain it to George Bush." So that led to a spoof briefing book that we produced at Sierra Club called, and we made it looked really wonderful. It looked like a presidential seal, the official briefing book on the climate change for President of the United States of America. And then you opened it up, and it was this little stick figure. This is planet Earth. It is where you live. And it went through the whole thing, more or less the way I had for my daughter's class at school. And it became a hot ticket item at COP11 in Montreal. But anyway, the issue is one that I think can be addressed, but not in a way that would make kids for 1 minute think that they can't play a part in solving it. Kids like to be involved.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just wondering the resistance kind of metaphor. Is there a place for kind of the older tactics of maybe Greenpeace that are really aggressive? What's the risk-benefit in the short term versus the long term?
Yeah, well, Greenpeace actually didn't do all that much aggressive tactics, but they've been very, very effective at essentially one-off stunts, really, more than an actual. They haven't actually so often blockaded, like the Clayoquot Summer, where 1,000 people were arrested in BC to protect the rainforest of Clayoquot Sound, wasn't a Greenpeace action. It was Friends of Clayoquot Sound, and it was lots of people prepared to do civil disobedience. There is right now a call on a website for people in the U.S. to be prepared to be involved in nonviolent civil disobedience against the Keystone Pipeline. And I've got lots of concerns about that. I don't think that the climate is right in the U.S. to move to civil disobedience. I don't think the education has been done first. I would rather that we, and I'm actually preparing a letter on this that I haven't sent to my friends who signed the Keystone Pipeline call. And I'm not really against what they're doing. I just think I've got a concern that it could go very wrong very fast. For one thing, any efforts these days to do things that involve mass demonstrations or nonviolent civil disobedience, anything that strikes the authorities as law-breaking is, and I'll be careful what I'm saying because I know I'm being videotaped here, but it's extremely likely to be infiltrated by agents provocateurs. It's extremely likely to have somebody who goes out of their way to try to entice somebody involved at some point to do something really stupid and then arrest people on conspiracy to blow up something. I mean, the risks to those involved in anything like that these days are quite different, I think, than the climate in the freedom marches in Selma. Things have changed in terms of what a movement can do safely. I think far more, and the other question is, how will people who don't understand that the climate change issue is a matter of life and death receive news that somebody's blockading something and arrested? As long as the news media isn't clued in, you might get coverage, but the coverage would be, these people just don't know how to make their point, and these people are troublemakers, and good, they're being carted off to jail. I think what's more effective as an educational tool of activism, and I've been thinking about this a lot, as you could tell from what I said earlier, is by analogy to what ended apartheid, by analogy of what ended slavery. So the movement to end apartheid included a lot of church groups, charities, universities, organized efforts to get people to divest their holdings from South Africa. Now, the Ontario Teachers Union, the pension of the Ontario Teachers Union, is heavily invested in tar sands. There are a lot of hospitals heavily invested in tar sands. If we were to start going after shareholder actions. We were to start going after letter writing campaigns to organizations like teachers to say your pension funds should not be in something that runs the risk of pushing us into runaway global warming. So there's a range of things that we should be doing. We certainly should be doing more than we're now doing, and we should be doing it differently. Because what we're, Canadian public, thank goodness, this country still has a rock-solid 80% of Canadians who understand the climate crisis and believe we need to take action. The fact that it wasn't an election issue is largely because they kept me out of the debates, but also because the media was prepared to keep repeating over and over again, the climate and environment is not an issue in this election campaign. Therefore, we move on and we don't ask people about it. But now that the election is over, I'm hoping environmental movement, and I'm no longer in the environmental movement in the sense of NGOs, so I don't know what they're plotting or planning or strategizing, because it would be quite wrong for even the groups with which I used to work to share their ideas with me, because I'm a political party and they should make sure they stay really nonpartisan. I don't know what they've got planned, but we're going into climate negotiations in Durban in South Africa in late November of this year, and the bits and shreds of hope that were cobbled together in Cancun as an agreement that leaves the door open to a second commitment period under Kyoto are right now don't have the support it will take to make that work. So as much as my focus is on domestic Canadian politics and my constituency issues in my riding, I'm also trying to figure out how do we change the U.S. government position. This is a real tough one. I mean, Barack Obama can't get the Republicans to agree to lift the debt ceiling before they default. But something's got to shift fast before we go to Durban, because if we're looking at freezing greenhouse gas levels so they stop rising no later than 2015, every single annual global negotiation process within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that doesn't result in progress is like squandering a decade, because that's how much we've run out of time.
I want to take one more question.
Sorry.
We've had Elizabeth with us all day.
Well,
Incredibly generous with her time. And I'm conscious of the fact that you're also standing.
Oh, no, I don't mind standing. I'm waiting for a hip replacement. I can't walk, but I can stand.
So,
It's not really a question, but I just want to make sure I understood you well. Did you say that you think 80% of Canadians are aware of climate change?
Je suis absolument certain. Absolument certain. Au cause de tous les sondages disent ça. All the polls tell us that 80% of Canadians are convinced of the climate crisis, believe we should be reducing greenhouse gases. But only 61% of Canadians voted, and only 39% of those voted for the Conservative government. And many of those people probably think, because the Prime Minister says it so, that there is a climate plan that they have. So it's if he were to run for office saying what I believe he believes, which is the climate crisis isn't real, there's no need to do anything about it, and our number one goal is to expand the tar sands, he wouldn't have gotten 39% of 61%. He would have gotten even fewer votes.
I'll take one more.
I have a question, and it's my education, my background on it is kind of unsure, so hopefully you can help to educate me. I was staying with two friends on Thunder Island last week, and they're very involved climate change activists, and that's where this information comes from. They told me that what we eat, where we eat in the food chain, is probably on par with the oil and gas industry as affecting or influencing climate change and global warming, and that sort of almost equality or surpassing oil and gas. That sort of statistic and information really surprised me, because I'd never read that or heard that anywhere. And I feel like they're both very reliable sources. So I guess if you could just maybe speak to that and how maybe we can, how that can get out there as far as fighting climate change and awareness and education and all those sorts of things. I don't know if it's right or.
Well, it's
I'd put that out there.
there's no question that eating meat is a large contributor to global warming. But the difference is that the oil and gas industry, I mean, part of it is the oil and gas that's used to grow meat, right? So it becomes a kind of a double counting problem. And that you have, the coal industry is by far the biggest. If we could shut down, there's two things we need to do. If you want to make it a really short list of what we need to do to avoid runaway global warming, it's shut down coal-fired power plants. Now, that's one technology and one fuel, and we can replace them with many other things, especially through energy efficiency, conservation, renewables, and the internal combustion engine, which lots of car companies are getting rid of anyway, beginning to work through to different solutions. So the role of meat eating is a factor, but it's not that large. And I've had the same discussion with them. I know them too. They're wonderful people, yes. Yeah.
I want to extend our great thanks to you, Elizabeth. You've been more than generous today with your time and with your insights. Elizabeth spent an hour and a half with our graduating cohort, as Rick said. We had a terrific discussion, and with other students as well during the day that she's been here, and it has really been wonderful to have you. So we appreciate it very, very much, and I'd like to thank you and extend our thanks on behalf of the audience here tonight.